when we started looking for speakers around our topics that we've been charged to talk about, we really wanted to focus a lot around what does industry think, what does industry do, and how are they dealing with some of these issues around international trade, export, and with traceability woven through that at every level. And so when I was given the topic of importance of traceability in protecting USA export trade, I decided to really focus most of my efforts on the beef cattle industry. Even though there's many of these topics that cut across all the species, I'm going to focus mostly around beef cattle because that may be one of our weaker links. And when talking to several of the bigger packers that are multiple species, most of the conversation always came back to the beef cattle side. And so with that, we'll start talking about international trade and traceability. When I thought about how do you want to approach, how should we approach looking at international trade, I thought, well, if you take an overview of what are some of the common expectations, or are there common expectations between us here in the U.S. and all of our international trading partners around the term or definition of traceability? And everyone I talked with, and from my past, yes, there is relatively a common theme, a common term, a common expectation when you talk about traceability, and that's being able to trace it really at this point in our industry's life from farm to fork. And there's lots of different segments that can do pieces of that, but as far as a formal system in the U.S., that covers farm to fork across all, again, beef, cattle, or all livestock, we really don't have one. However, when you think about the expectations for traceability as to how they're defined, do we as a global community with our trading partners have a common or formal definition of the process that has to be used to do that? And no, there's not. I.e., Japanese trade, the livestock beef cattle trade with Japan is different from a traceability standpoint, paperwork standpoint, expectation standpoint than those export verification programs with other countries. And so there is no formally defined process with all the other trading partners. When you think about common definition for traceability, there's no real common definition as to how everybody specifically defines traceability as far as at what point at the farm, is it individual or is it group, is it as those groups move through the system or is it as individuals move through the system. And again, you can go back to Japan because you have two different systems that operate that can be exported into Japan for beef cattle and beef cattle products. One would be using the less than 20 months or 20 months and less, if that's how you want to say it, and one is using the A40 carcass maturity classification. And so there's different definitions that are assigned from a traceability standpoint with one of our key trading partners. And then you have WTO rules that come into play. And how does that fit into the whole traceability issue or definition? Well, with China and South Korea and some of the other countries who are asking for traceability, some of their challenges that are actually a little bit positive for us is they cannot define or expect us to do more than what they're capable of doing. And so at this point, WTO rules as to how fair trade of services and commodities are traded are weighing in our favor at this point when we talk about beef cattle. And then, of course, there's the financial and economic considerations when you have other countries look at, how cheaply can we export products into their country. You can call it protectionism. You can call it anti-dumping. There's a number of different things and legal avenues that one country can take against another to import a tariff if they want to do so. And traceability will be no different from many of the people I talk to. So when we talk about what's our competitors, who are our competitors, maybe is the better question when we're talking traceability and international trade, the first one that really comes to mind is Canada. And obviously our neighbors to the north have worked on an animal ID system, a traceability system, if you will, and they're improving upon what they've had. They're being given credit internationally for those efforts and are globally recognized for doing so, and being ahead of where the U.S. is today when it comes to beef cattle. The one that comes to mind the quickest, and everybody was quick to point out and talk about, was, however lacking we want to think their system was in Canada, they were still recognized by beating us back into the Japanese market. And so we need to think about, instead of how do we look at someone else's system, how does the global community look at that system and recognize what they have or what they don't have? BSE is still an issue up there, of course, but they are working to resolve those issues, and because they are working to improve their system, that's becoming less of an issue with their trading partners. And they're also, because of this improving system, they're aggressively pursuing other markets that we probably are going to not have as quick as an opportunity to participate in. And those markets who are desirable for us are desirable for them. Can they fulfill those markets and the demand? Maybe, maybe not. But they are pursuing them aggressively. Other competitors, international countries that we would consider competitors, is Australia, obviously into Asia. They're BSE free, and they do have some formalized animal ID system, at least on the beef cattle side. And so again, whether or not we believe that to be as good as it should be or meet all their claims is really not for us to decide. It's for their trading partners to decide. The third one that came to mind through many of the conversations I had was Brazil. And even though there's some nervousness, I guess is the way I'd put some of the comments, around Brazil, they also recognize there's areas in Brazil that are basically FMD free. They're zoned or compartmentalized, and they understand that. But within those zones or compartmentalization, there's a lot of traceability going on. And the ability to trace individuals, not just groups. And so that is a big concern, one, because of their sheer numbers and size, but two, because of their cost of production differences from here in the U.S. Also, though, they recognize that the quality of differences are very vast between the U.S. beef and probably what they're exporting. The challenge that they see with Brazil is some of the past compliance and trust issues with some of their trading partners, particularly focused on Europe, and how will that hold them back internationally as trade and traceability go forward. So one of the things I thought, maybe is the best way to really look at how do we protect ourselves is to thinking about, in business, a lot of times businesses will go through a SWOT analysis. So what are our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats? And can we get real, roll up our sleeves and get real about what those truly are or are not? And so as I talked to a number of different people for this presentation, here were some of the most focused on comments and issues and thoughts that they had. And also, if anybody here has been through a SWOT analysis from a business standpoint, whether it's someone's farm or whether it's a corporation, you always have this balance between strengths can also be threats, threats can also be strengths. And so there is some interchangeable here that we have to think about. The strengths that were most identified is, the U.S. has a wonderful reputation around animal health and animal health systems with our veterinarians and USDA, FSIS, and those things. Also, the reputation of having a wholesome food safety system and processes of assuring that that system maintains its wholesomeness and delivers wholesome, safe food. Also, we're recognized as the U.S. as a very active member in the global organizations that deal with trade, fair trade, which would be WTO, which we talked about earlier, OIE, which is mostly around, obviously, the live animal health and disease and classifications and how those are taken care of globally. And then Codex, which is around more of the sanitation, food safety, and consumer protection standards. And so the U.S. is recognized from the meat production, food production systems to have a very good reputation and deliver what we promise to our global partners for the most part. They were also quick to point out, though, that because of some of the latest news in the last month, 30 days, 45 days, 60 days, of some of the MRLs, and I'll say, I won't steal anybody else's thunder from that, is there are questions being asked of our live production industry of what are we doing and why are we doing what we're doing. And of course, economics comes into play first and foremost when you talk about and talk to those people who are using it, using those products. What are some of the U.S. traceability weaknesses? And again, sometimes there's strengths as well as a weakness, and so there's a balance. There's no formal ID system where everybody participates at some level the same, from the producer all the way to the processor. And every one of them see that continually as a major weak link in our system, in our ability to maintain trade and fair trade and get our share of the dollars and economically that we're due long term. We have 800,000 plus producers, some very large, some very small. Again, some of that's a strength, some of it's a weakness, but that's a concern. The market segmentation and the livestock movement that we have in the country is very different, maybe more complex than many other countries. And the challenges that that complexity presents when you're trying to attain traceability or true traceability. The inconsistent messages and capabilities between industry and government. Now again, I talked to only industry, big players in the industry. And many times they felt like over the past 10 years or so particularly that there's been differences of opinion between what industry can do and what government promises. Sometimes overpromise, sometimes underpromise. And sometimes it's specific to a country or a trading partner. And they see that as a major weakness going forward. And I'll talk about a little bit more of that in a minute. The cost of traceability, the cost of true traceability in the U.S. because of the number of producers we have, because of the complexity of our system of animal movement, and because of the speed at which commerce does move here in the U.S. The lack of consistent use of technology, and I won't steal any of Brian's thunder, but if we had consistent high-speed technology that moved at commerce, how much could that quickly change the cost in the face of traceability, particularly in the beef cattle system today? But these are weaknesses that they believe are kind of the top 5 or so that most of them talked about. So where are the opportunities? Well, there's over 30 export verification programs that most all the packers participate in. Some of them fewer, some of them right around 30, some of them more. But they choose to participate in those, and all of them have different requirements for traceability or paperwork or what have you. So there's a variety of things they choose to participate to maintain the global market and the financial and economic contributions those make to their business and back to the industry. Another opportunity was the emerging global markets where we have a continual improving of the standard of living. Yes, the global economy has been kind of in a stagnant situation over the last 18 months, but it's improving. And some of these countries are improving quite quickly to where they're going to expect more of what the, I know you're not supposed to call it first world countries, but the very dominant economic countries expect. Our opportunity is to provide probably clearer and better leadership and traceability standards around the world. They believe that the U.S. and even some of them would say even partner up with our Canadian friends and say, how do we provide the leadership and set standards or help set standards for what real traceability in a formal way would look like with all the trading partners. First in the market, normally you get the first bang for the buck, but also help establish the market value that the traceability can bring, and not let other countries establish what traceability is worth. And this was a big one to them, because once you're able to do that, some of the comments were such as, if we can establish that traceability is worth X more dollars per pound, or X more cents per pound, versus another country, because of our costs probably being the highest within our global trading partners who are demanding or wanting traceability, we can help set that standard, not be undercut to our production costs. And then more vertical sharing of the critical and marketable information. And what that really meant was most all of them would like to see, as information is gathered to build a traceability system, is that producers and processors and everybody in between has at their access information that helps them improve their business. Production data, if a producer needs carcass data, how do we make that system where it's transferable and more transparent? What are some of the threats? Well, the one that came to mind quickest and was talked about at length was other countries' willingness and focus to meet new market traceable demands. And what does that mean? Because I asked them, what are you talking about? They said, really what we're talking about is, take Canada for example. Because of their energy and effort to improve their current system, which is already ahead of the U.S. system, what if Canada is able to access the Chinese market before we are, in a big way? Will that mean there's going to be a shift where feeder cattle will then go north? Because in a roundabout way, those meat products are going to be worth more if they go through the Canadian system than what they will be if they go through the domestic U.S. system for export. I don't know, but it's a concern for some of them. Foreign animal disease situations. What if we're not able to track it and quickly contain it? That continues to be on the forefront of what they see as a definite threat. What if the industry decides, back to the government versus industry, to control some of the negotiations of what's acceptable verification directly from a company to the government or from company to company? So a large company in the U.S. talking to a large company in China, and they decide what's acceptable for traceability, and the government, so what gets left out. That's kind of gone on a little bit, not so much in the U.S., but in some other countries. And then the MRLs, which is going to be talked about later this afternoon, but that's a big challenge that hasn't hit the beef cattle side yet so much, but some of the other species have dealt with. Is meat products are the first thing that come to mind because that's what the consumer's eating. But what was brought to my attention was the byproduct side, particularly like a tallow that's going to go into feed, that's going to go into maybe other food products. What are we going to do about that if we can't trace it back? So if you take an outlook, if you will, for the meat industry, or meat, beef particularly, there's a fairly strong belief that we're going to see some kind of a shift. Yes, true. You've got the currency challenge between U.S. and Canada, but that there could be shift from cattle, particularly Nebraska north, feeder cattle going to Canada if they access a couple of the markets based on traceability alone that we have not been able to, or may not be able to, as quickly. Constrained by being mostly a domestic market, will having the lack of or not being able to have traceability in the U.S., will that constrain us to being mostly a domestic reliant market, particularly beef? By not leading the way or not being out front, they're afraid we're going to lose some of our global leadership and status in this arena, lose global and domestic consumer confidence. If the domestic consumer is willing to accept it today, that's great. But as our foreign partners and our foreign trade partners and the foreign consumer, because we all travel, and a lot of people travel, more and more of our consumers are coming from other countries to visit or otherwise, and they're expecting to know more, and they're expecting traceability domestically here. So do we lose consumer confidence globally first, or do we shake consumer confidence at home first? What's going to be the timeline to catch up if we continue to wait and continue to fight? I'm going to use fight because it seems like that's what's kind of been over the last 10, 15 years. How long does it take us to catch up? Again, I'm focusing on beef cattle, but how long does it take us to catch up to where our other trading partners already are, or at least some of them? There's a huge concern with an economic and financial lost opportunities. They see it. Producers can't afford to continue to have a shrinking market. We already have a shrinking herd. So how does that impact us? How does it impact their businesses? How does it impact the allied industry businesses? And how does it impact food costs, domestically and globally? And then, of course, there's always other unknown consequences that's not very easy to put your finger on and try to say, well, this specifically is going to have an impact, or this specifically will be impacted in this way. And so their last real message was, as they have exported more and tried to open up more markets at a higher level economically, asked more for the demand of our products, and several of them have done some consumer testing with foreign visitors being here in the U.S., visiting for whether it's college kids or whether it's corporate executives that have been sent here for 2 or 3 or 4 months, that global consumers expect to know more and have more assurance of higher food safety standards. And the answer that they kept getting back was, that means traceability. And again, that means traceability back to the producer. And that was driven home to me a number of different times, that we as an industry in the beef cattle industry have got to start thinking harder about the overall impact of what we're not doing and what that will reduce our industry to if we don't.